Good afternoon and good morning. Welcome to Center for Migration Studies. My name is Mario Russell. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Migration Studies, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Untold Story, Migrant Deaths Along the US-Mexico Border and Beyond. This important and significant webinar is the result of significant and extended investigative, forensic, and research work that's been conducted by today's panelists and another dozen or so colleagues who have been with the Journal on Migration and Human Security working on developing a number of articles that appear today, and you'll find this on our website, in a special edition issue called Forced Migration, Deterrence, and Solutions to the Non-Natural Disaster of Deaths along the US-Mexico border and beyond. An incredibly important and timely conversation and report. The report itself, the collection, is the product of three-way partnership led by Don Kerwin with the Journal on Migration and Human Security, Center for Migration Studies, the University of Arizona Binational Migration Institute, and the Working Group on Mapping Migrant Deaths. So, deaths at the border, deaths in the desert, and I'm brought to think about how much we have learned and internalized and been aware of deaths in the seas, in the Mediterranean, and elsewhere. And like those places, certainly the space at the border, whether it is the desert or elsewhere, has become a place of the unfolding of tragedy with great human consequence and cost. And so I'm pleased to have Don Kerwin today with Courtney Siegert, Heather Edgar, and Daniel Martínez, respectively professors of anthropology at Texas State University, University of New Mexico, and of sociology at the University of Arizona, join us today in this very important, though very somber topic to talk about the causes, direct or indirect, of deaths at the border, to talk about what is and what are the accounting methodologies, who's doing it and how, what are the levels of advocacy and voice that are given to this question today, and of course, what can be done? Are there solutions? Are there recommendations to manage this and answer to it? I'm deeply grateful for the time and the effort of the Journal on Migration and Human Security and our panelists today in bringing this issue forward, this unseen and silent tragedy that needs an enormous amount of attention and equal parts of healing. So without further, Don, let me pass this to you, and thank you and welcome everyone.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mario, and thanks to the Center for Migration Studies for supporting this work and for hosting this webinar. We really are grateful to you. Just to pick up on the theme, this special edition is really the work of a remarkable working group of medico-legal professionals, social scientists, and humanitarian organizations who are devoted to mapping and accounting for migrant deaths across the US-Mexico border and even beyond the border. And accounting for deaths, it means more than accurately counting them or enumerating them, although that remains a major challenge as the studies indicate. What it means is identifying decedents, investigating deaths, determining their causes, and repatriating remains to loved ones. And it means understanding this phenomenon because understanding it will point to ways to prevent future deaths. The papers in this collection document that official Department of Homeland Security tallies don't count migrant deaths in Mexico, don't count the deaths of persons who aren't found, of course, and don't even count all the migrant deaths that come to the attention of the Border Patrol. They also document the types of deaths that are less likely to be counted, including persons found without identification, whose remains are in poor condition, and who aren't found by Border Patrol officers themselves. And it's not just that official counts aren't accurate, they're also not timely. We still don't have Department of Homeland Security statistics on deaths for FY 2023 for 2024, which makes it far less likely, because they're not timely, that measures can be adopted in real time to reduce deaths. In response to these problems, several papers in the collection raise the idea of establishing a more centralized, systematic system, whether regional or national, to document and to enumerate deaths, which would permit credible sources to report on deaths. The special issue also examines the causes of migrant deaths, as its title suggests, and I think it makes a very helpful distinction between legal and factual causes. That is, between the underlying foreseeable consequences of certain conditions and policies, that's legal causation, and the direct, immediate factual causes of death, like dying from the heat, cold, or drowning. The literature mostly attributes migrant deaths to U.S. enforcement strategies, and in particular, the prevention through deterrence strategy. That's really a theory, and kind of under the theory, if crossing becomes too perilous, then irregular migrants, it was thought, would be dissuaded from coming. And in fact, we know that using enforcement to redirect migrant flows to more dangerous and remote routes results in increased deaths along these routes. Dan Martínez, who's going to speak today, also shows that asylum restrictions, particularly Title 42, contributed to increased deaths. Other papers show that the fortified wall has led to more deaths from falls, as well as crippling injuries. And well-known Border Patrol tactics contribute to deaths, like buzzing and scattering migrants with helicopters, pursuing them to exhaustion, and dangerous chases, as Robin Reinecke and Dan Martínez show in a terrific paper. The separation of thousands of parents from their children, many of them resulting in permanent severance of parental and child ties, is viewed by its champions as the ultimate deterrence policy. But as Abby Cordova, Jonathan Hiskey, Mary Malone, and Diana Orsez find in a paper titled Undeterred: Understanding Repeat Migration in Northern Central America, desperate persons aren't deterred. They keep coming, particularly those who understand the risks. The threat of violence and food insecurity drives them, despite the extraordinary levels of enforcement spending. So this special issue identifies underlying causes of death, such as the conditions that force people to migrate, antiquated U.S. legal immigration policies, failure to invest adequately in the adjudication of asylum claims, and the defeatist sense that deaths are an unsolvable problem. It's not that the common explanations, like that migrants assume the risk of death or that predatory smugglers are to blame, are totally untrue, but it's that they don't suffice. For its part, DHS reports on migrants dying of natural, accidental, or undetermined causes. And this is true as well. These may be the immediate factual causes, but they're hardly the whole story either. According to Gabriela Soto, categorizing deaths in this way tends to naturalize them and does nothing to address their underlying causes or lead to their reduction. Deaths have surged to the point that the International Organization for Migration in 2023 characterized the U.S.-Mexico border as the world's most dangerous land border. The papers point to why we should care enough to try to solve this problem. They point to the human toll exacted from the migrants themselves, their loved ones, surviving migrants who witness deaths, diverse community members who find bodies known as situational participants, and traumatized Border Patrol agents themselves. And these bodies are not just in proximity to the border, they're often well beyond it. And finally, the crisis points to just how grossly underfunded many of the rural localities are, and particularly their medical examiner and justice of the peace offices, that bear the brunt of this crisis of failed federal policies. Let me just, finish here before introducing our speakers, but, a common priority of truth commissions and peace accords is to account for the missing and the unidentified dead, whether they're viewed as enemies or allies, natives or non-citizens, invaders or the children of God. Their fundamental insight of these truth commissions is that they're human beings in every single case, and they deserve a dignified closure to their lives. Congress and DHS, with their strong commitment to securing the borderland, should really care as well about this issue, and they do care to a certain extent. The fact is that the homeland is not secure. It's littered with bodies, people who, as Josiah Hyman writes in his paper, mostly die while trying to avoid dying at home. So that's the situation that we're at. Let me introduce our speakers in the order that they'll speak. Each is going to speak, for 7 to 10 minutes, and this will leave time for questions, which you can also send in via the question and answer function. In fact, that's the only way that you can ask questions, I think. So first, Courtney Siegert is a co-editor of this collection and authored an important paper titled "The Texas Landscape: Accounting for Migrant Mobility and the Challenges of a Justice of the Peace Medical Legal System." She's a forensic anthropologist at Texas State University and a postdoctoral scholar with Operation Identification, which seeks to identify and repatriate unidentified human remains. Edgar is professor for anthropology and a forensic anthropologist for the Office of Medical Investigator of New Mexico. She has co-authored a groundbreaking study with Jasmine Hernandez, first study that I've actually seen on deaths in New Mexico, titled "Migrant Deaths in New Mexico: What is Known and What is Unknown." And Daniel Martínez is associate professor of sociology and co-director of the Binational Migration Institute at the University of Arizona. He served as co-editor of this special issue and co-author of the introductory paper. He also co-authored a study for this special issue on the effect of COVID-19 on migrant deaths in southern Arizona with Sam Chambers, Jeff Boyce, and Jeremy Slack. And in addition, he co-authored an article with Robin Reinecke and others on enforcement tactics that may be thought to constitute excessive force and contribute to migrant deaths. And finally, he co-authored an article with Marnie LaFleur and others, which is connected to this collection and will come out soon. It's titled "Migrant Deaths in California." So let me turn to Courtney Siegert now. You have to take the mute off, Courtney. We can't hear you.
Okay. Now let me reshare. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, great. So, can y'all see the tracker, or I'm good? Everybody can. Okay, great. So thank you for the introduction and for organizing this great panel and webinar. I'm going to try and keep this brief, but those of you who are joining and may or may not know me, I can be a little verbose. So I'm Courtney Siegert. I'm currently a postdoctoral scholar at Texas State University working with Operation Identification. I wanted to highlight Molly Maranker and Stephanie Luder, who are both not co-authors on my specific contribution to this special issue, but are based in Texas and had really significant contributions to this entire endeavor and have unique perspectives of what's going on in the region right now. Okay, maybe I can't advance. Okay. So just to kind of orient everybody, I encourage everybody to actually go and read the paper. It is open source. So title of our paper based on OpID, Operation Identification, which is a humanitarian project formed to address structural challenges and assist border counties with recovering, identifying, and repatriating presumed migrant remains recovered from the borderlands in Texas. Our basic kind of overview and kind of orientation for you guys is to reiterate some of the things that Dan and I'm sure my other co-speakers will discuss as well. But that migration now and as it relates to migrant deaths has really changed in this post-pandemic world and post-Title 42. And we have increasingly limited access to refugee and asylee pathways, and part of that has contributed to increased irregular migration in Texas, and then border enforcement at the state level and national level in Texas has then contributed to an increase in migrant deaths in this kind of new era of prevention through deterrence and deaths along the southwest U.S.-Mexico border. I want to highlight too that it's currently not possible for those of us working in Texas to provide an accurate accounting of migrant deaths due to the decentralization of the medical legal death investigation system here in the state. And so Don mentioned that there is justices of the peace in Texas that are responsible for investigating unknown deaths, including those of transnational migrants or individuals that are not U.S. citizens, which really complicates efforts considering justices of the peace are non-experts that are tasked with this very complex process. So it takes a lot of institutions and organizations to move a single case forward. And so one of the big takeaways for our paper is like broad strokes takeaways is that the death investigation system in Texas needs to be completely restructured in order to serve not only the unidentified persons who may or may not be U.S. citizens, but also unclaimed individuals as well as community members in the state and the region. Okay, so changes that are happening in migrant deaths as we're shifting into this kind of like new era of migration scholarship, I guess, is that we're seeing a change in routes in along the Texas-Mexico border. So predominantly in the past, we've had increase in deaths through the Rio Grande Valley, which is closer to the Gulf. And over the past several years, we're starting to see a change in routes where there are increased encounters, I guess is the most appropriate terminology right now, increased encounters in other regions farther west along the U.S.-Mexico border in Texas. So I'm sure many people are aware and have heard and seen a lot of the news out right now regarding Texas surrounding Eagle Pass. Eagle Pass is where that's where this image is taken. This is the Rio Grande River at Eagle Pass. The sister cities I'm sorry, Piedras Negras, but we're starting to see a shift in not only where people are crossing into these other areas that have historically seen not many crossings or deaths, and they're now being overwhelmed. We're also seeing an increase in diverse countries of origin, and I want to note that we're increasingly becoming aware that this is a global issue with many individuals that our project has recently identified originating outside of the Americas. And this is only going to continue to get worse as humanitarian need across it continues to grow. Our key challenges that that we've really identified are having this mixed system where non-experts are bearing the burden of investigating these cases when they have limited forensic science backgrounds. There continues to be limited coordination among various stakeholders and deteriorating diplomatic relationships, particularly with countries like Venezuela, as well as Nicaragua and a few other South American countries. And there's a lack of access to available resources. The biggest policy recommendations that we have put forth through this paper, at least, is increased access to national databases for non-traditional medical legal actors. There's a lot of, because this is in our world, we kind of live in this criminal justice system. Operation Identification is really pushing a disaster victim identification protocol for cases where the cause and manner of death does not seem to be attributed by another person, and they're not violent deaths. The really big concern is who these people are, where they came from, so that we can provide them their names back and then also provide families with answers. I have gone over on my time, I think. So if there is time remaining later, we can always come back. I have a few more slides prepared, but I also want to introduce you to our team. And I wrote part of our team with an asterisk because this is just an overview of paid staff. I mentioned before that we are, Operation Identification is housed at Texas State University, and we rely a lot on volunteers and the students that are also part of the communities that we're working to serve. So that's why this is just part of the team. And the biggest updates that I wanted to relay to you guys from our project is that there is this new epicenter. We're focusing on Maverick County, our efforts in Maverick County. Our urgent needs from everybody in attendance is to continue to advocate for the missing and deceased and their families and vote in this upcoming election. Like I said previously, we are currently pushing forward this idea of focusing on a disaster victim identification approach, because that's how we've been viewing migrant deaths along the US-Mexico border, as a chronic mass disaster that's humanitarian in nature. And one of our proposed solutions for that are regional identification system centers in key regions along the US-Mexico border. And I will come back with some good news. Hopefully people have questions. So I'll stop sharing at that. And
Thanks,
thank
Courtney.
you.
We do have some questions, but maybe we'll take them towards the end, because some of them apply to the other speakers as well. Heather, can you jump in now?
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for including Jasmine and I in this special issue. It's an honor to be part of such a prestigious group working on such an important issue. I do have a few slides I'm going to show, just I think 4. But before I do, I thought I would give people a little bit of background on kind of why New Mexico has been a black hole as far as information in the past, and why that's changing now. And I'll just say that the reason that you haven't ever heard much about New Mexico as far as migration isn't because we were hiding things. It was just, this was not a destination for migrants in the past. So that our rates of migrant deaths in the past were our rate of migrant deaths over decades was extremely low and could be dealt with it within our standing medical legal system. And it's only been since 2021 that we've seen some changes, and I'll show you that in a slide. So unlike Texas, that has a very decentralized system, New Mexico has a centralized medical examiner system. So there is one medical examiner office, that's the Office of the Medical Investigator, and it serves the entire state. New Mexico is geographically the 5th largest state, but it has a population just over 2 million. So it's an extraordinarily rural state with big empty areas, including along the border. We have one office with medical examiners, and that's in Albuquerque, situated at the University of New Mexico, and that's where I am now. And any death that requires medical legal investigation is served by either central office investigators, people who are based in this office and serve our local area around Albuquerque and Bernalillo County, or we also have in almost every county of the state, field deputy medical investigators. And so these are part-time employees who have specialized training and are on call, and also have they have hours that they're on call. And so if, for example, along the border, Border Patrol finds an individual, the process is that deceased in the desert, they call the local law enforcement, and then law enforcement calls our central office, who assigns a field investigator to the case. Law enforcement, if needed, will go out. If Border Patrol is already involved, a sheriff doesn't always attend that death. But as long as we have some law enforcement agency and a field investigator, we can investigate a death at the scene, recover the body, whatever state that it's in, and body transport brings that individual to the office up in Albuquerque. So that's the process. And then from there, whatever is the needed process for medical legal investigation, whether it be an autopsy, an anthropological investigation, all of those kinds of things. And then investigation of identification happens throughout that process. One of the primary ways that we identify people is through fingerprints, working with the Border Patrol. So we use their system for comparison. And if the person has attempted migration before in the past, but survived and been sent back, then they will be in Border Patrol's system. Their fingerprints will be, and we'll be able to match fingerprints and get an identification. In the case where the body has decomposed beyond the point where fingerprints work, or if they are not in the Border Patrol system, then we rely on a number of different forms of visual identification. Beyond that, that's when things get challenging. So for every individual whose identification we investigate, we would then look to dental x-rays or other radiographic comparison. And if all of those options fail for identification, we work towards DNA. DNA is a challenge for us because we don't have a lab anywhere in the state of New Mexico currently that has the ability to process DNA from bone. And so that means relying on commercial labs outside the state for those analyses, and that can be quite expensive. We do not have we have no budget right now for that. We are very fortunate that we've received funding working with the city of Albuquerque, the Albuquerque Police Department, and the New Mexico DNA information system to support a great deal of our DNA costs. We also have received funding from the Consulate of Mexico in cases where we have a good idea that the person is Mexico. They'll often cover those costs. And we've worked with the Argentinian forensic team on a few cases as well. So we still are piecemealing the way that we cover those costs, but to date, we're doing okay with it. So with that kind of background of New Mexico as a centralized system, a very rural state, and one that until recently did not have high rates of migrant deaths, I'll go ahead and share a couple of slides to show you what the picture is like today. So everyone should see a table. It'd be great if somebody could give me a thumbs up or a shout out saying, yes, they see it.
Yes, we see it, Heather.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay. So to me, this figure, it tells the whole story. So you can see that our migrant deaths are extremely low. And if we went further into the past, they would continue at the rate of 5 or less per year, pretty much. And so it's in 2021 that we saw an increase. And then there was an AP story recently that reported that we'd had a tenfold increase in migrant deaths, and that's true since 2021, or excuse me, since 2019, but it's on average, it's more like a 20-fold increase in deaths. So 2023 is a finalized number there at 117. 2024, we have already surpassed that number. And this is just through August. We did have additional deaths in September and October. So I think we're at 130, 135 now for numbers. And just for comparison, these are similar numbers to what's seen in Arizona, which has traditionally been a high area for migrant deaths. So we've gone from the lowest rate to matching very high rates. This changes everything about the way our office works. In addition to the tragedy, it's a process and procedural set of issues that are difficult for us. Okay. So where are these deaths occurring? So here we're just looking at 2020 to 2024, and the brownish square that you're looking at, the brownish part of the bar, that's Doña Ana County. And that's down at the very place where New Mexico, Texas, and Mexico meet. So we do have deaths in other parts of our border. We don't have a very long border that's direct between New Mexico and Mexico. But as you can see, the majority by far of cases are happening in Doña Ana County. And in fact, if we looked at this even a little closer, that we would see it's not evenly distributed throughout the country or the county. It's actually very closely associated with the New Mexico, Texas, Mexico border near Sunland Park, New Mexico. I wanted to bring this up that we have a history of male and female migration, being that male migration has generally, if we went back into time to 2009, you'd see that those identified individuals were mostly male. However, in the last couple years, we're looking at, in some cases, more than half being female. Now, what we don't know is since 2023, what the apprehension rates look like. So it might be that females are dying more than you would expect given their proportion in the migration group, or it might be that this is exactly the proportion you would expect. But because as far as last time I checked, you could only find apprehension information up to 2022 from the Border Patrol, we don't know what apprehension looks like in the times that are most important to us for comparison. So we don't know if females are dying at a rate higher than one would expect. And then just finally, this is my last slide. I wanted to talk a little bit about where people are coming from. We identify in the low 80s percentages of migrants. So that's pretty good. We could do better, but we do pretty good. And so these are the countries of origins. And as you can see, this is over the entire 2009 to a couple of months ago period. 62%, a little more than, are coming from Mexico. And so it's a good thing we have a really good working relationship with the Consulate of Mexico. Guatemala is our second most frequent location of origin. We also have developed good working relationships with them. And then beyond that, it's low proportions for everybody. We have had our first non-American migrant deaths, I mean, non-America's migrant death from Jordan just in the last year or so.
Thank you
So
very
I think,
much. Yep.
go ahead. I was just going to end with saying our presentation and our contribution to this issue is nuts and bolts, right? It's really core basic information to start with. And since, as far as we know, it is the first stuff from New Mexico, we'll be growing from here. But we wanted to make sure that everybody knew what was going on here, that things are changing fast. So thank you.
Thank you. And you're covering a lot of the questions that we're getting, actually, but we'll still have plenty of questions at the end here and time to talk a bit. Dan, you're up now. I think I botched the introduction of one of Dan's articles, which is about Title 42 and its impact on increased deaths during COVID. So it wasn't two articles, it was one. But anyway, he's responsible for something like 4 articles in this collection. So who knows? Maybe there's a fit.
Well,
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, you bet.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Don. Can everybody hear me okay? Sounds good.
Yes.
Okay. So as Don mentioned, my name is Dan Martínez. I'm an associate professor in the School of Sociology and a co-director of the Binational Migration Institute here at the University of Arizona. Special thanks to Don, to Mario, to Kevin, to my co-panelists, Courtney and Heather, as well as everybody who's contributed to this special issue. I mean, this is a special issue we've been working on for nearly a year. It grew out of a mini conference that we hosted here at the University of Arizona about a year ago, but this work precedes that conference, right? This is part of a working group that has been working together for the last over 3 years to try to get to a place where we can start to adequately track and enumerate migrant fatalities along the U.S.-Mexico border. And again, I just want to acknowledge that this is work that we're building off of seminal scholars, many people who are joining us here today: Carl Eschbach, Jackie Hagan, Nestor Rodriguez, and others, the work of Wayne Cornelius, Maria Jimenez, the work of Raquel Rubio Goldsmith. If it weren't for all these folks paving the way more than 20 years ago, we wouldn't be doing this work today. Also, a special thanks to all the medical legal investigators or authorities around the country who do this work. Again, if not for them, we wouldn't be doing this work. So let me go ahead and advance my slides here. So several articles in the special issue actually establish a direct connection between forced migration, increased border enforcement, namely the prevention through deterrence strategy, and migrant deaths along the U.S.-Mexico border. Now, these associations are well established in the empirical literature, going back to even the late 1990s. However, over the past decade, we've seen a notable change in the demography or the demographics of migration along the southwestern border, as well as the state's response to these changes. So let me give you an example here. So here we see Border Patrol apprehensions or encounters, which is a term they started using during the Title 42 expulsions, in the Tucson sector. And these are data from 2007 up to fiscal year 2023. And we also have the data by national origin. So here we see 2 notable changes. First, we see a notable decline in overall apprehensions, coupled with a gradual shift in the nationalities of those apprehended. And this is, again, for the Tucson sector. However, in 2021, we saw a notable increase in encounters, as well as an increase in the share of non-Mexicans being apprehended in the Tucson sector. So in short, migration has shifted from predominantly young Mexican males migrating for economic purposes to remit money back home, to in more recent years, recent decade, to men, women, children, and family units from diverse countries arriving to the U.S.-Mexico border to seek asylum. Now, this shift really started about a decade ago. Some of you might remember in July, I believe it was 2014, particularly in South Texas, we saw the so-called Central American migrant crisis, or the unaccompanied minor crisis. But we really see the notable change happening post-pandemic. I think this next figure actually does a better job of illustrating this change in diversity, right? So here you have just, this is in terms of proportionally, in terms of shares of apprehensions or encounters, what proportion are from the respective nationalities listed below the x-axis. So I think, I'll just give you an example. So back when I was doing some of my field work for my dissertation back in the mid-2000s, roughly 97% of the people who were being apprehended in the Tucson sector were of Mexican origin. So Mexican migration really was largely Mexican dominated. However, as of last fiscal year, 2023, roughly only half of the people who were being apprehended in the Tucson sector were of Mexican backgrounds, right? And I should point out that these demographic changes have been much more pronounced in South Texas. So if we thinking back to the work that Courtney's doing and her team, Molly and Stephanie, right? So these demographic changes are much more pronounced in South Texas. Why? Because of proximity, right? Obviously, to get from Central America to South Texas is a much shorter distance than making it all the way up to the Arizona-Sonora border. Okay, so that actually raises a really important question. How has the state responded to these demographic changes at the border, particularly this influx of asylum seekers? Well, we know that according to U.S. law, international law, migrants have a right to petition for asylum at the border, right? So rather than denying people access to the asylum system, the state has actually made it increasingly more difficult to start or even complete the asylum process, right? So recent examples include the metering of asylum seekers at official ports of entry, or the migrant protection protocols, or the Remain in Mexico policy, and more recently the use of so-called Title 42 expulsions, which used the COVID-19 pandemic as a pretext for preventing asylum seekers from even being able to initiate the asylum process, right? I won't get into too many details. We do provide in our piece an overview of metering, migrant protection protocols, as well as Title 42. But I think this raises a really important question. So given these notable demographic changes, what, if any, what, if any, is the association between Title 42 expulsions, or the use of Title 42 expulsions, and migrant deaths in Southern Arizona? Okay, in order to address this research question, we drew on data from the Pima County Office of Medical Examiner. So here we have a few pieces of information. First, you see the Pima County Office of Medical Examiner's jurisdiction, which includes Pima County, Santa Cruz County, Cochise, Graham, and La Paz. We also see the bold outline is the Tucson sector. So this is the Tucson sector, the U.S. Border Patrol, and then the lighter gray is the state of Arizona. So we're drawing on the medical examiner's office's records. In my opinion, I think the Pima County Office of Medical Examiner really has represented, they've set the standard when it comes to investigating the deaths of migrant border crossers across the U.S.-Mexico border, right? This is something that they've been doing for more than 20 years. Since 2000, they've investigated close to 4,000 deceased migrants, and so they really, and this is a medical legal authority that operates, again, at the county level, right? Which is very different than what we see across the border, which allows them, it gives them the possibility of being able to do the work that they do. So we draw on these records to essentially look at these relationships. So this next slide actually shows you it's a depiction of increased border enforcement, the relationship between increased border enforcement and migrant fatalities across the Arizona-Sonora border. So we know that, for instance, the Prevention Through Deterrence strategy was launched in 1994. Part of the Prevention Through Deterrence strategy was Operation Safeguard here in Southern Arizona, which was implemented in 95, expanded in 97, and we actually didn't see resources materialize on the ground until 1999. And it was the following year, in 2000, where we saw the first notable increase in migrant deaths in Southern Arizona. But as I mentioned, this association has been well established, right? So what we're really interested in looking at is what, if any, is the relationship between deaths and the state's effort to try to impede access to the asylum system. And so again, we address this research question by drawing on these records from Pima County Office of Medical Examiner. So here in this figure, you actually see this represents, I believe it's over 4,000 recovered remains. And again, these are just remains that have come to attention of authorities, right? The other thing I want to mention is that it's really easy to get lost in these figures, right? We see 4,000 people's remains. The remains of 4,000 individuals have been recovered from Southern Arizona. But what does that mean? That means that each one of these individuals is somebody's mother, somebody's father, somebody's sister, brother, niece. These are people. These are people who are connected to communities back home, connected to communities here in the United States. And we have to think about the effects that a lot of these individuals, the family members of these individuals have endured, right? The sense of what my colleague Robin Reinecke calls a sense of ambiguous loss, okay? All right, so what did we end up finding? So what we end up doing is we focus on two main eras. An era we call the localized funnel effect era. I'll spare you the details. We describe it in detail in the article. But this era ranges from 2014 to halfway through fiscal year 2020. This is what we call, for the purposes of this discussion, I'll call it the pre-Title 42 era. Then Title 42 was implemented in March of 2020, and this is what we call the Title 42 era. So here we can see that there's a notable increase in deaths during the Title 42 era. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I think on average, in the pre-Title 42 era, we saw an annual mean of about 130 some deaths per year. During the Title 42 era, this increased to 198 deaths per year, which roughly translates to about a 48% increase in deaths during Title 42. Well, why does this occur? Well, we know that under Title 42, again, under Title 42, if somebody was caught crossing the border, they were simply just returned back to Mexico, expelled back to Mexico to the nearest port of entry, without even given the opportunity to initiate the asylum process, right? And so we know that based on data from DHS, that the recidivism rate, that is repeated attempted entry into the United States, increased during Title 42. I think it's roughly about, if I'm not mistaken, I think it varies by demographic, but it's well over 50%. So well over 50% of people who were processed through Title 42 tried to cross the border again within 1 year, compared to roughly 25% of all encounters, right? So there's a notable increase in recidivism rates among people who are processed through Title 42. Why, right? It's because these folks are, seeking asylum. They're fleeing, violence in their home countries. As Joe says in his paper, these folks die from while trying to avoid dying at home. Okay, so I think that makes it very clear that there is this association between Title 42, or blocking people's ability to access asylum, and repeat migration. So that's part of what might be going on here. Well, clearly this is just an association, but we're also interested in looking at the geographic relationship between the use of Title 42 and where these remains were being recovered, right? So this next map just illustrates these are 99, 95, and 90% confidence. These are clusters, these statistically significant clusters of recovered remains along the U.S.-Mexico border, comparing the pre-Title 42 era in blue to the Title 42 era in red. So what is it that we're seeing here? Well, we're seeing that there's this clear shift away from the West Desert pre-Title 42 towards the U.S.-Mexico border, specifically ports of entry where people were being repatriated during Title 42 of Nogales and Agua Prieta, right? So this suggests to us that people were engaging in repeat crossing attempts, and were ultimately just becoming, fatigued, getting to the point where they're fatigued as a consequence of being processed through Title 42. I'll just keep my remarks relatively brief here. We also compared some of the demographic characteristics, as well as leading causes of death among folks who's perished during the pre-Title 42 era compared to those post-Title 42. What I want to point out is just three main findings here. The remains that the medical examiner's office was that they were investigating during the Title 42 era. These aren't the remains of individuals who died 5 or 10 years ago, right? We know that based on this body condition scale, right? Here we see a clear increase in the proportion of remains that were coated fully fleshed or even decomposed. We know that if they're coded 1, 2, or 3, or 4 on this body condition scale, the death likely happened within weeks, if not months, of when the remains were recovered, right? So we're not talking about remains being recovered of individuals who perished, 2, 3, 4 years ago. These are relatively recent remains. Similar to what Heather mentioned in her presentation, we have seen a increase in the proportion of females represented among the deceased. Not quite what we're seeing in New Mexico, but in the pre-Title 42 era, only about 8% of the remains were female, compared to 14% in the Title 42 era. And finally, we see a notable increase in the proportion of remains of folks who are from Guatemala. So I'll just wrap up my comments real quick here so we can have plenty of time for discussion. As I mentioned just earlier, we saw migrant deaths increase from an annual mean of 133 during this period immediately preceding Title 42 to 198 during the Title 42 era. We saw remains recovered during Title 42 being clustered closer to the border and close to the cities of Nogales and Agua Prieta. So essentially shifted from west to east in southern Arizona, which corresponds to places where people were being repatriated during or expelled during Title 42. And we also find, as we discuss in the paper, that Title 42 did appear to disproportionately affect Mexican and Guatemalan nationals, but as it is reflected in the deaths, it particularly affected Guatemalan nationals, right? So the share of Guatemalan nationals actually increased during Title 42. Now, in closing, I just want to, give a special thanks to the folks at the Pima County Office of Medical Examiner. We wouldn't be able to do this type of work without them, without their dedication. They really have set the standard when it comes to investigating migrant fatalities at the U.S.-Mexico border. However, this office does encounter notable barriers to being able to do this work. So just echoing what Dr. Edgar mentioned in her remarks, perhaps one of the most significant challenges is the limited financial resources to conduct DNA analyses to identify the deceased. So in fact, several of our colleagues at PCOM, the Pima County Office of Medical Examiner, have actually used their personal time, their own time, to write grants to try to secure funding to do this work, right? So for me, here's the ask. If you know of any possible funding mechanisms, foundations, private donors, or whatever that might be able to help, please let us know. So you can reach out to us. I'll put you in contact with folks at the Pima County Office of Medical Examiner. I can put you in contact with Dr. Edgar. I can put you in contact with Courtney and her colleagues in Texas. Dr. Bruce Anderson also asked me to mention that anyone who has purchased a direct-to-consumer ancestry kit but has not shared their profiles with one of the several publicly viewable databases, if you do so, you make it possible to utilize your SNP DNA profiles to identify some of our thought to be Latin American descent unidentified individuals, irrespective of nationality. So my understanding is that with these direct-to-consumer ancestry kits, there is underrepresentation of Latino individuals. So this relatively new field of investigative genetic genealogy, or IgG, has actually already produced a dozen identifications here in southern Arizona at PCOM. But again, currently, Latino Hispanic users are underrepresented in the publicly viewable databases that these IgG groups rely on. So that was kind of the pitch or the call. If you have any leads on potential funding sources for DNA analysis, and if you have purchased a direct-to-consumer ancestry kit and are of Latino or Hispanic background, haven't shared that profile, if you do so, they're now able to access that to help with identification processes. So with that, I'll go ahead and stop, and I'd be happy to address any questions you all might have.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Yeah. What I'm going to do is I'll look at and I'll give you all time to look at the questions and answers too, if you haven't been looking at them. I think we've been covering some of the questions that people have. And then maybe we'll go to each of you for kind of a final 2 minutes, and you can answer or respond to any of these questions that you like. But basically, well, first, hi to Robin Hoover, who it is true has been started mapping deaths in early 2000, and he's kind of a legend and founder of Humane Borders. So it's nice to hear from him. I think that one of the questions involves who's involved? What's the agency landscape in an investigation? I think Heather responded to that to a certain degree. If anybody would like to say more, they're welcome to do that. Maybe just the difference between a medical examiner model and a justice of the peace model. There's questions related to, is there really the political will to kind of restructure death investigations in Texas on a state level? And what would the advocacy look like for that? Resource challenges, if people want to raise those, recommendations that are important that didn't get covered. What are some of the populations, the non-traditional populations that you're seeing showing up among the migrant decedents? That's another kind of issue, large issue and question that people have. State obstacles. Dan, a question for you on, you know, how can you tell that the effect of Title 42, and it's not an issue of just increased flows. So why don't we stop there? And go in the order that we originally went in. Courtney, I don't know if you want to spend a couple of minutes answering any of these or clarifying any of these issues.
Sure, yeah. And if I'm able, am I able to share my screen again just to kind of point back to some images and things like that?
I don't think we have time to do a lot
Okay.
of that. So maybe
Yeah,
just
no
jump in
worries. Yeah, so I guess there's a lot of questions. Political will is something that we've been struggling with a lot. One of the big issues with the mixed justice of the peace system is that justices of the peace are elected officials with minimal requirements to get the job. They have to be elected and have a high school diploma. So they don't have backgrounds. They don't have necessarily have backgrounds in forensic medicine, even though they're tasked with establishing how and why somebody died and also who they are and where they came from. And so in much of the state, if people can remember the map image in my slides, much of the state is under justices of the peace. The populous areas of the state are under a medical examiner that has specialized forensic training. And so because so many of the actors that we work with are elected officials, we are continually having to go and do education and outreach to update these actors with new methods, having to educate and train them on how DNA works, educate and train them that that there are resources that provide this kind of investigative tools for free or at a minimal cost. And so we've been doing a lot of centralization or attempting to do centralization to prevent any of these unidentified persons from being lost to the death investigation system and essentially disappearing administratively within the state. So those are big pushes. One of the other questions was diverse countries of origin. So out of the Americas, we have an individual that was identified from Syria, several from South America, and then one individual from the Ivory Coast. I'm not going to try and pronounce that. And then the good news that I did want to share is that the update from our publication is that we have, since final manuscript submission and everything like that, we've identified or facilitated the identification of over 30 more individuals. So, yay, good news.
Congratulations. Yeah.
Thank you.
Heather, do you want to answer whichever of these questions or clarify that you'd like to?
Sure. There was a question I can answer pretty quickly, which was about how identification works, what are the methods that are most common. And so I had that information handy, and about just short of 64% of individuals who are found in New Mexico are identified via their fingerprints, either through border patrol comparisons or other fingerprint methods. So that's the primary way. Beyond that, things like visual identifications, driver's license, and a few, we need multiple pieces of information to make those work, but that's the next most common way. And we are only using DNA for about 3.5% of our identifications. And we are at 81 point something percent identification of migrants, which for comparison, we are at about 99.5% of our general population. So it's good, but also bad. And then another person had a question about humanitarian organizations and pushing for better work. I'll just say here in New Mexico, we're really excited to work with humanitarian groups that will help us to find remains. So far, that's by far the smallest source of us finding remains. Like just regular people hiking or biking or whatever, finding or remains more often than humanitarian groups. But we love the idea of working with groups. I think the work that humanitarians are doing here in New Mexico as far as mapping has been absolutely fantastic, and I really appreciate the efforts of No More Deaths specifically. I'll call a little shout out to them because they've been super helpful and fantastic to work with, and a lot of people are drawing on their data. But I don't know, I actually feel like we're doing an excellent job of investigating these deaths in New Mexico. Could we do better? Yes. Are we always trying to improve? Yes. But I think I'm really proud to be part of this organization, and I think we're serving the entire community of New Mexico, including migrants, as an equal, fair, and we're a state institution that works. It's a rare thing.
Thank you. Dan?
Sure, I'll just jump in real quick. So I know that we don't have a lot of time, but what I will mention is that all of these articles are available. They're open access right now, available for download on Journal of Migration and Human Security's website, so you can visit there. We also prepared a series of fact sheets or one-pagers based on, we have a border-wide one-pager, kind of based on central take-home points from the special issue. And then we have a series of state-specific ones. So we have a one-pager on California, one on Arizona, one on New Mexico, and one on Texas, based on the empirical findings from each of these articles from each of these states in the special issue. Now, the big question, okay, so, you know, obviously, the number of deaths could be a function of flows. If there are more people being encountered, you know, during, you know, is that what's driving this, right? So that's a great question. In my own previous work, we've actually tried to estimate a migrant death rate, approximate migrant death rate, or what I should probably call a recovery rate, where you take a number of deaths in a given year divided by apprehensions or encounters, standardize it to 100,000, and that gives you an approximate migrant death rate, or rate of death, or rate of recovery. I've moved away from that approach recently because the landscape has changed drastically, right? So this made sense in, let's say, the 2000s, when the overwhelming majority of border crossers were young Mexican immigrant, undocumented migrants coming to work for the purposes of, you know, remitting money back home, and were actively trying to avoid detection, right? However, things get much complicated when we start talking about asylum seekers, right? Asylum seekers have a right to present at a port of entry and to initiate, or, you know, until recently, you know, at the entire U.S.-Mexico border, even with a Border Patrol agent, and to try to initiate the asylum system. So presumably asylum seekers shouldn't be at the same risk of death when compared to undocumented border crossers or people who are actively trying to avoid detection. So you couple that in with increased recidivism rates and the differences in which, the different ways in which Title 42 targeted people from Mexico and Guatemala disproportionately relative to other nationality groups. And it becomes very complicated to try to, you know, we try to do this, and it's tricky. So what we're doing here is, I completely agree. These are associations. I'm not able to, you know, establish a definitive causal link between the implementation of Title 42 and these deaths, but we look at this through triangulation, through different perspectives to get at this, right? Now, can we do this? Yes, we can. We can essentially try to establish causality, but we would have to get access to information from DHS about individuals who were processed through Title 42. And then we'd be able to look at, for instance, among people who were apprehended in the Tucson sector from 2014 to the present, look at, you get all the names of individuals, try to match those records with records of identified individuals at the OME, and then there we would be able to do that, right? But I think that that bureaucratic hill might be a little too difficult to climb. If there are any journalists out there or any academics who are interested in pursuing this or have ideas of how we might be able to do this, it can be done, but we would need to get information about the individuals who have been apprehended by DHS and been processed through Title 42 and ultimately repatriated, and see whether or not they're disproportionately overrepresented among identified remains at the Pima County Office of Medical Examiner.
Thank you very much. And thanks to all the panelists, to Courtney, to Heather, to Dan, to all the authors of these papers. They're really it's a remarkable body of work, and I'd really commend the papers to you. We didn't discuss them all, of course. It's 11 papers in total, so please read them. And most of all, thanks to all the people out there that, you know, do this crucially important work and are dedicated to improving it, moving ahead, because it's a real, it's just it's a very, very important project and a mission that they have, and they're devoted to it 24/7. So thank you for your great work.
The last thing I'll say is I want to give a plug to Josiah Heyman's concluding paper in terms of re-envisioning the border and the border as a commons. I think that's really inspiring, and it gives us a way to think outside the box, to move away from discussions of increased securitization or zero tolerance policies, and discussions of open borders, to think of the borders as a potential place of collaboration, the borders as a commons. So that's my plug for Joe's piece. Thank you, Joe.
And just a final question for you, Dan. What are you going to do with all your free time now that this collection is out? You have any plans?
I got about 6 other irons in the fire here, so
All right.
I'm gonna keep working on this and other work. So we're I'm increasingly interested in asylum seekers. So a lot of my work in the past is focused on undocumented border crossers, and obviously with the changing landscape, I'm really interested in people's experiences trying to navigate the asylum system.
Courtney and Heather, any final words real quick?
Just appreciation. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Courtney, thank you for being a co-editor and good partner all these months.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. As I'm young in my career, so having the opportunity to do this has been amazing. I've learned a lot from all of you, including other contributors to the special issue. And then I just wanted to, my final remark, kind of pinging off of Dan's comment about the borderlands being a common space, right? I think that is also something that if we reframe the collective we being, actors in the US that are interested or follow these issues of migrant deaths, that if the people who hold power start to shift their thinking around this region as a common space, then I think that holds the potential for really changing what's happening, and actually reducing the amount of human lives that are lost.
Basically a place where problems can be solved rather than a place of exclusion. So thank you all. We'll end on that note.